Welcome to Module 2 of Digital Forensic Essentials, and we're going to talk about the investigation process in this module. We're going to have a look at four major areas. Area number one is the importance of the investigation process. We're going to look at the pre-investigation phase, the investigation phase, and finally the post-investigation phase. Let's do it. All right, so first of all, the importance of investigations. We're going to look at understanding that process and its importance, and so let's get started. The forensic investigation process, what it is a methodological approach to investigate, seize, and analyze. So investigate, seize, and analyze digital evidence, and then manage the case from the time of the search and seizure to the reporting of the investigation results. So all that management that we'll be doing, and I want you to know that in terms of seizing that evidence and analyzing that evidence, that's what the rest of this class is all about. But that's what the process is: investigating, seizing, analyzing, and presenting. So it's a very important process. Digital evidence is very fragile. It's ones and zeros held in RAM, held in buffers, held in caches, on hard drives, on video controller cards, on disk drive array caches, all kinds of places. And so it's very fragile, and we have to follow strict guidelines through the forensic investigating process to make sure that we have integrity of evidence that is critical when this investigation goes up in front of a judge in a court of law. So we have to be, if you're a forensic investigator, that process has to be followed. The investigation process needs to comply with local laws and establish precedents. And this is a really important one: established precedents. Let me just give you an example of an established precedent that's actually extremely interesting. Okay, so in your house, your apartment, your flat, a lot of people have a mat on the front door outside of your domicile. And what does that mat say? It says, welcome. All right, it says welcome. And most people have a welcome mat. In the United States, in states like Texas and Florida and many other states, they have what's called a castle doctrine. Castle doctrine says that if somebody bursts into your house, breaks into your house, you have the right to defend that house with deadly force, irrespective of who, what, when, where, how that happens. For the most part, that's called a castle doctrine. Even though on the front porch of your house it says welcome, that doesn't mean that anybody who wants to can just walk into that house. However, there is case law that says, like for instance, let's say in an organization, I have a router, and the router has a web page at the IP address of the router. And the web page says, welcome to XYZ Corp's 7509 router. And if it says welcome, there is case law that supports an attacker attacking that and then being able to be exonerated because there was a welcome message on the router. So I really need to know established precedents, and I can help my organization by saying, hey, there's established case law. Even though that router has a nice secure message, HTTPS or whatever, if an attacker discovers it, then they're welcome to attack that router. So knowing some of the established precedents in investigation processes and even in case law can be very helpful for the forensic investigator. So any breach or deviation from established precedents, from legal standards, can jeopardize the entire investigation. Investigators must follow an repeatable and well-documented set of steps. This is what I was talking about in the last module, how we have to drill this. We have to have good SOPs. If in your drill you discovered that something is missing, then you go back through and write it back into the operating procedure. Yeah, every iteration of this SOP, we have to analyze, and no matter what we're doing, it needs to be able to, under those circumstances, have the same findings. Otherwise, it can be invalidated under cross-examination in the court of law. They can say, you went through this process and you found this data. That's correct. And we have physical copies of all of this, and we went through that process or a different process or your same process, especially if you go through the same process and find different data, then you can invalidate it. So yeah, very important to have a good forensic process. In fact, there are phases that you need to be aware of for the forensic investigation process, including the pre-investigation phase, where you have tasks that you're going to do before you start the investigation. For instance, setting up that forensic lab that I mentioned up earlier, making sure you have forensic workstations for your forensic investigators, making sure you have a good forensic toolkit. We'll talk about all this in this class. Setting up the team, getting approval from your management and the hierarchy of your organization. All of that happens before you ever hit your first investigation. Then we have the investigation phase, which is the main phase that you acquire the evidence, you preserve it, you analyze it, you identify the source of the crime and the culprit behind it. That's all part of the investigation phase. And let's say that you identify the culprit. You identify the group that attacked the organization. Then we need to document all of the actions that were undertaken. And by the way, this is part of the investigation phase too. So as you go, you're documenting all your actions, all your findings, making sure that you have a report that's very easy to explain to a target audience and gives you adequate and acceptable evidence. And when we say acceptable, that means acceptable where? In a court of law. All right, let's talk about the forensic investigation process, and we're going to focus on a specific part of that process, and that is the pre-investigation phase. We had a little bit of overview of it just a few moments ago, and now we're going to look at it in depth. Setting up the forensics lab. So one of the items in making sure you're ready for forensic investigation, that you have very good forensic readiness, is that you need to have a well set up computer forensic lab. This means that you need to have an area set aside for this. So if you don't have a forensics team yet, and your organization's putting together a forensics team, it's not just the team you need space for the forensic lab. What's going to be in this forensics lab? It's going to have instruments, software, hardware, forensics workstations, and computer-based investigation capabilities so that you can collect evidence. In fact, one of the cool things you can do right now is go to DuckDuckGo. I like DuckDuckGo for images better than I like Google, but I would say go to DuckDuckGo, type in Computer Forensics Lab, and then go to Images, and have a look at all the different computer forensic lab setups that are out there. Some of them look more realistic than others, but you can get an idea of what I'm talking about if you go to DuckDuckGo and type in Computer Forensics Lab. And in these labs, we have many different things going on. Number one, we need to make sure that we have adequate budget for the lab, not just to establish the space where it's going to be, but ongoing maintenance. So how many cases are we going to have a year? The type of investigation, how much manpower are we going to need for this lab? These are things we need to try to establish before setting up the lab. And then we're going to need equipment. We're going to need hardware and software for this lab. So this is going to be the planning and budgeting of the lab. And one of the areas that might help with that is to benchmark, where you go to other organizations or engage other organizations that are similar to yours that have forensics labs and find out what it costs. How do they put together their forensics lab and forensics organization? And you can get a much better cost idea from that investigation. All right, number 2, in setting up your computer forensics lab, the physical and structural design. So you need to make sure it's properly sized for your organization and what you expect to be able to do in that lab. You need to have access to services, workstations, spaces, areas. You need storage areas, evidence lockers, evidence storage, and you need to make sure you have adequate HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, because you may have some types of evidence that can be affected by too much heat, too much humidity, too little heat, too little humidity. So you have to think about that in number 2. Number 3 is the work area. So you need to have workstations where people can sit and work in an environment that has appropriate ambience, internet communications, network communications, lighting, even emergency power. For instance, you might be doing a very important copy of a hard drive or some other type of computer information from one computer to another location, and your organization has a power outage. And if that copy is broken, it might actually cause the evidence to be destroyed. So where you have these critical activities taking place, you might want uninterruptible power supplies for the lighting, etc. Number 4, physical security considerations. You don't want anybody just to be able to wander in to the forensics lab. These people need to be cleared to be in it. It's almost like a secret operation in terms of the security of the operation. So electronic sign-in, intrusion alarm, fire suppression systems. You may even want to have some type of camera recording, etc. for that, especially for the evidence lockup area for that forensics lab. Human resource configuration. How many personnel do you need? We talk about that in the manpower section when we're planning and budgeting, but you'll need to know how much are we going to pay each of those. We also need to make sure they're doing what you are doing right now, training and certification. So there may need to be people who take forensics classes, like the one that would be a follow-on to this one here at EC Council. We also need to get the lab itself certified. There is the accreditation that's called ASCLD/lab, and we also have the ISO IEC 17025. Now, if in the planning and budgeting of that lab, you have already planned for 1 or 2 of these certifications, then you'll much better be able to absorb the cost that's going to go with getting these certifications and accreditations. So you might have a lab. It has fancy computers in it, fancy equipment in it, but it's empty. It's empty until you have the team. The team is going to be the ones who are conducting the investigation. It needs to be small, lean, intelligent, and well practiced in their art of forensic investigation. We don't want information leaks. We want to be able to identify them, assign them responsibilities, and we want to make sure that every team member has the necessary clearance. So if this were a government or military, we would actually have a security clearance for each of these team members. But since this is perhaps a civilian operation, you'll need to develop your own method for providing clearance for each of these team members. Like, for instance, let's say that they have a background check, they've been working there for X number of months or years, or accomplished a certain number of tasks, and have achieved a forensic investigator certification from EC Council or from somewhere else. So on their badge, they get a red dot or a gold star or a black check mark or whatever. And so you can tell by just even looking at the badge that this person has achieved a certain rating. You know, I don't know, your organization might come up with some other way to have somebody cleared to look at certain levels of evidence. And they need to be authorized to do certain tasks. Remember, the forensics team is going to run into all kinds of data from the organization. Human resources data, potential credit card or financial transaction data, data from secret projects that are being run by the organization or whatever. So yeah, you need to have them cleared and authorized to conduct the tasks that we have them on. Assign one team member as a tech lead, team lead, whatever you want to call them for the investigation. And that can rotate between individuals, or it can be usually the same person depending on the roles you have established for your forensics team. So there are people involved in the investigation. They are photographers who, don't use your cell phone camera. We need an actual set of cameras that we can use specifically for the forensic investigation. Incident responders, they're the ones who are responsible for the measures that we take right away when an incident occurs. And we have an analyzer that analyzes the incidents. We have the evidence examiner, investigator who acquires the evidence, sorts out what is useful from what needs to be skipped over. The documenter, the manager, the witness is one who's going to be doing the formal testimony. And you need an attorney, a lawyer associated with the team that provides that legal advice. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Do you need to have at least 8 employees on your team? No, some of these are going to be taken as multiple roles by a single person. For instance, you might have a incident responder who analyzes and examines the evidence and documents it. And if you have an incident, you give them a camera and they photograph it. So it really depends on your organization. If you are a Fortune 100 organization with 1 million employees, you might separate all these roles out, right? But if you're a medium-sized company, might have 4 or 5 employees that all cross-train in all these roles. So when you are setting up the forensic lab, the lab is going to have hardware and software requirements. If you were looking at pictures of forensics labs, you may have seen some disk copying equipment and cables of different types and stuff like that. That's what we're talking about. So it should have the necessary and hardware and software tools to help with that process. Hardware, we're going to have 2 or more, depending on the size of the forensics lab and the number of employees. So 2 or more forensic workstations with good processing power and RAM. So you don't want to skimp on these workstations. You don't want to take a used workstation from a user in accounting and pop it into the forensics lab. No, this needs to be ready and specialized for forensics. The cables for all of the different interfaces that you might encounter in your organization. Write blockers for drive duplicators. You want to make sure that when you're duplicating the drive that you don't accidentally write something to that original disk. Archive and restore devices. So you can take the data that you dump off of the drive or off of memory or whatever and archive it, and then make an appropriate duplicate copy of that. Media sterilization. You may need to wipe after an investigation is over or after certain tools are no longer needing to be used. They need to be wiped and sterilized 100%. We also have one other equipment that allows forensic software tools to work, computer hardware, like we have Parabin's First Response Bundle, DeepSpar Disk Manager, the FRED workstation, it's a forensic workstation. If you look these up, you can even pause the video and have a look at these. We're going to see some of this in iLabs. You can follow me as we work through some of the forensic investigations in iLabs. You'll see what we're talking about there. For software, we'll need operating systems, discovery tools, password cracking tools, data acquisition tools, data analyzer and recovery tools, file viewers that can give me images and graphics, and file type conversion tools, security and utility software, and then computer forensic software. We'll see more of these in the lab, like Wireshark and Access Data's FTK and many others. So there's a lot of tools that we'll need, both hardware and software. And guess what? This should all be in the budget. in the planning phase to make sure you have the adequate tools for the job that you're going to be doing. All right, now we're going to look at the forensic investigation phase. We're going to actually not be at the pre-investigation, but we're going to be at the investigation phase of the forensic investigation process. So it's time to investigate. What do we do? There are 8 different processes, 8 different items that we need to look at in terms of investigation. That includes documenting the crime scene. That includes searching and seizure of evidence, preserving that evidence, acquiring and analyzing data, analyzing the case, and reporting our findings, and potentially testifying as an expert witness when that digital evidence is presented in a court of law. Documenting the electronic crime scene. The documentation of the electronic crime scene is necessary. Why? Because we want to have a record, maintain that record of all parts of the forensic investigation process. We're going to identify, we're going to extract, we're going to analyze, we're going to preserve evidence. And more than likely, you're going to be using software tools to help you get closer to automating this process. And it's not going to be a total automation, because it's really going to be like using a boilerplate or a template and then filling in the details that you have. But surely it's not like in the old days where you have a piece of paper and you write everything down. Although I will say this, that even a lot of forensic investigators that have electronic means of tracking these things also have paper backup in some cases. Some things you want to remember. Number one, you want to document the physical crime scene. Remember what I was telling you about on those crime shows where they are tagging all the individual pieces and taking pictures. Well, you may have to take a picture of the computer system and the surrounding area, or if it was in the data center, of that rack of computers, or wherever the crime is focused. Even if it's focused on multiple locations, you're going to have to physically document the position of that system and others. Imagine somebody picking up a flash drive and bringing it in and plugging it in a USB port, and then that port and that flash drive cause a virus or a worm or some other type of malware to break out onto the network. You want to take a picture of which port it was in, and hopefully it's still in there, and if not, of the exact flash drive that was used, etc. So you want to document that. Also, details of any related and difficult to find electronic components that may have been around at the time. We need to document those. And then the state of the computer system, any digital storage media, electronic devices, and the power status of each device. Next, we get into search and seizure. So what we want to do is we want to plan it, we want to secure and evaluate it after the initial search, and then seize the evidence at the crime scene. So with the planning, we need to make sure we have consent. Because what if on the crime scene, part of what we're dealing with belongs to the organization and another part of it belongs to an individual? And we may need to obtain signatures from statements that we obtain from witnesses. And it's possible that in a legal sense, you will need to get a warrant if you need to do any further search and seizure. And then collecting that information is vital. So on the initial scene, we're going to need to do an initial search. Look around the initial scene, see what is happening, and then after evaluating and securing it, securing means that no evidence will be tampered with in the process of the investigation. Whether that means putting crime tape around the scene to keep people out, or that means posting a guard, you need to make sure that that crime scene does not get tampered with. And then seize the evidence, dealing with powered on computers, powered off computers, networked computers, and there's going to be a system shutdown procedure that you're going to have to know for every type of operating system and device that you find. And then you need to deal with mobiles and other handhelds. So all of that needs to be worked with, and we'll be talking about that as we get deeper into the class. Now, in terms of search and seizure, you need a plan about how that's going to be executed. And that plan needs to have these details: a description of the incident, the case name or title of the incident, and also very likely there's going to be a unique number associated with this case. The location, what about the jurisdiction? Where did it occur? And is there legislation that applies to this? What about the extent of the authority to search? Do you have that authority? And then one of the most important, as we'll see as we continue the forensic investigation, is creating a chain of custody document. If we ever need to hand off the investigatory materials to another jurisdiction, there will have to be chain of custody so that the evidence is securely preserved even as it gets transferred from one group of people, organization, jurisdiction to another. Details of what is seized: the search and seizure type. Was it overt or was it covert? Even in a corporate situation, there can be covert seizures. For instance, you may have a company-owned laptop and you are watching an employee that you are sure is doing some type of inside hacking or trading or whatever. And you note the patterns of the employee. You know that periodically they'll leave the laptop, and one day they do. So at 2 a.m, the forensic team does a covert seizure of that laptop. Nobody's watching, nobody sees, and they take it. And in fact, they may even be able to dupe the drive, grab the memory, etc., and then replace that back exactly where it was, and maybe even bug it so that they can continue the investigation. There's a lot that can happen with these types of operations. We also are going to need approval from local management. So in the little scene I was talking about before, this is not something that the forensics team would do on their own. The forensics team would already have the employee under investigation. They would already be working with management, with legal counsel, and with human resources before they plan the covert op to go grab that laptop. And so hopefully they will already have had approval from local management. And in all things, we need to take health and safety precautions. So for instance, you don't want to block exit ways with your investigation. You don't want to cause any more damage to safety of employees or other people or their health. So there are so many important things. I keep saying one of the most important things, but this is extremely important to preserve the evidence. We want to make sure that when we have that chain of custody document and we have some a group of people from a different jurisdiction and they require a copy of the evidence, it needs to be securely preserved so that it can be held up in court. So evidence preservation is where we have proper handling, proper documentation to make sure there's no contamination of that evidence. So for physical or digital evidence, when that evidence gets seized, it needs to be isolated. It needs to be secured. It needs to be transported securely. We're going to talk a lot about this as we get deeper into the class. And then preserved, because we want to make sure that, especially for digital evidence, not a single one, not a single zero of any of the digital evidence that we've captured has changed or has been tampered with. It's very important to make sure it's isolated and secured. So at the time of the transfer, both the sender and the receiver need to provide information about the date and time of transfer if there is a transfer of this evidence. And that is going to be part of the chain of custody document. It's called the sign-off, a sign-off on that, the receipt of the evidence. And the procedures, why do we have those? Because those protect the evidence and they document what's going on, collecting that information in a logbook, making sure the tags uniquely identify the evidence, and there is a chain of custody record. Another important part of the forensic process is getting that data. We were just talking about the chain of custody, about making sure that we preserve the evidence. But here's the question: how do we get the evidence in the first place? And part of that is data acquisition. So what we're going to do is image the drives, image the memory. We're going to make a one-to-one copy of the exact pattern of binary digits that we find in whatever media, and we're going to do this in accordance with standards for analyzing forensic value. So we need to forensically process and examine the data that was collected, examine that information. And what we want to do is find evidence that is relevant to the case that we are pursuing. And we also want to, at the same time, protect that data, protect its integrity, meaning, again, that not one zero or one in the entire set of digital evidence changes. So one of the most critical steps is if we have an improper acquisition and we alter the evidence, alter the media, then it will render it inadmissible in court. The gavel goes down and the judge says it's dismissed. That's one of the worst results. So we need to be very careful to verify the accuracy of all of the data, and the process also needs to be verified, and it needs to be auditable so that if a third party decides to audit the process that we're using, that even the process itself will hold up in court. Once we have the data acquired, the next thing we want to do is analyze that data. And so we're going to examine the data. We're going to identify the different components of the data, looking for that evidence, separating and converting and modeling the data. And again, looking for that evidence, looking for useful information, looking for a trace of what the criminal was doing. The data analysis depend on what we're doing, the scope of the case. For instance, you may be just analyzing RAM. Why? Well, because maybe you or your forensics team was hired to work on a part of a project that another forensics team does not have expertise in that part of the project, so they hire you just to do that. Or you may be working with the scope of the entire company. So when you're doing data analysis, the phase includes analyzing files, date, time, creation, modification, all the users that might be associated with the creation, the file access times, file access type, any modification or physical storage location of the file, and generating a timeline for that file access, for that data that we're dealing with. And what we want to do in the end, this is an area that we'll spend more time talking about in the rest of the class, which is identifying the root cause of the incident. And then we move into case analysis. So we've collected data, we've bagged and tagged, and now it's time to analyze what it is that we've actually been dealing with. And so in this case, the investigator can relate all of that evidential data to the case details for understanding how the complete incident took place and figure out what we want to do in the future, our future actions. Like, for instance, we might want to explore other investigative procedures to gather more evidence, like checking host data, examining network service logs, going to that SIM system and doing a log analysis at the point in time where this was occurring, finding any other information of evidentiary value, collecting case-specific evidence from social media, branching out to find out where that employee or that contractor, whoever it is that is involved with this investigation, and maybe even remote storage. Maybe they stored stuff in Dropbox or on a Azure storage unit or something like that, S3 bucket, right? So then we gather additional information related to the case, aliases, email accounts, ISPs that were used to transport that data, names, log configuration, system logs, passwords, any data that we can get associated with the applications and network information that the alleged criminal used. By interviewing different individuals, we can find out what they were doing. And we could, like for instance, we might find somebody who says, oh yeah, that's really interesting because every day at 9, I saw Fred kind of leaning back in his chair and I wondered what he's doing, but he was always backing it up. And I remember seeing a logo and it said Box on it. So maybe he was backing it up to Box. And maybe what Fred would do is he would install the Box client, log in and do the backup and then uninstall the Box client. And so during the investigation process, perhaps I didn't look at that because it wasn't installed on that system. But now I know perhaps that is where some of the data is stored. So additional information. And then we want to consider the relevance of components that are out of the scope of the investigation. So there may be components that are not part of the investigation. So equipment like laminators, check paper, scanners, printers in the case of any fraud, or digital cameras in the case of child pornography. So what we're doing is we look at the equipment on the laptop or the desktop itself, but then we look around and say, oh, hey, over there in that corner, there's a copier. Let's go grab the logs and see if there's any evidence. We can even look at the fingerprints on the copier and see if the criminal's fingerprints are on top of the others, or maybe they were using it very recently. We can go look at other types of, let's say there's a camera at the front entrance, but there's also a camera in the data center. Did he ever pass to the data center? What time was it? Does it correlate with activities that I'm investigating? So we have to go outside of some of the normal areas to make sure that we can get as much data as is needed to close this case. All right, now we're going to move into the post-investigation phase of the forensic investigation process. So at this time, we've gathered all of our data. We have come to conclusions, but we're not at the end yet. So we need to gather and organize our information. And so our documentation, as we document, we need to decide what information is appropriate to the investigation, and then we organize it by categories. For instance, procedures. We have procedures that we use to gather the evidence. That needs to be documented. So all of our notes from the different phases of the investigation, making sure to identify the facts, the evidence, the conclusion, and then information gathered, and then we put that together into a concise and usable report. We need to have a report that is the outcome of the investigation, that's appropriate to the audience, that's written in a clear, concise language, and it needs to have the details of the incident, cover all the necessary information in a concise manner, be technically sound, but yet understandable to the target audience. Should also be structured in a logical manner so that the information can be easily located, especially if it's also submitted in an electronic form, and it should be able to withstand legal inspection. If a lawyer, jurisprudence from any part of the investigation looks over it, they should be able to say, yes, this is legal. And it should adhere to local laws and be admissible in court. So, what will really help is to have a boilerplate, to have a template. And this is a template that has the executive summary, the case number, any information like social security numbers, authors, investigators, examiners, names, purpose, significance, signature analysis. Now, in that executive summary, you may not have all of that, but these are some of the major components. You will have some of these in the executive summary. And then we have the investigation objectives. What did we seek to accomplish during the investigation? The details, date and time of the incident, when it allegedly occurred, the report to the agency's personnel, detailed information about the people who are writing the report, and then what process did we go through, the date and time it was assigned, who was allocated to investigate it, and then the nature of the claim and information provided to the investigator. So there may have been a ticket or a call or somebody who claimed that something happened that actually spurred the investigation, and that needs to be documented. So in that template, we'll also have evidence information, location of the evidence, a list of the collected evidence, tools in collecting the evidence, preservation of the evidence. So we need to document all of the evidence that we have for this case, and what did we use to evaluate and analyze that evidence, and any supporting information, including the full path of important files, any reviews by experts and opinions by experts, and even supporting details like what methodology the attacker used and users' applications and interest activity. This is actually important because we can look at the standard way that the user behaves, and if they deviated from that significantly, and that correlates with the criminal activity, then that's significant. And then recommendations, we're going to need that also in the report. One of the last things that you might end up doing is testifying as an expert witness. And so you're going to present evidence in court. You need to have knowledge of new, specialized, and evolving and complex technology if you want to be an expert witness. And so there are going to be things that take place in court, and you need to be aware of how a courtroom works. And if you are not familiar with how a courtroom works, then there are YouTube videos that can help inform you. You can actually look up a video on going to court or what takes place inside a courtroom. If you are very, very familiar with what goes on in a courtroom, I won't ask you how you know. All right, so familiarize the expert witness with the usual procedures that are followed during a trial. So we need to make sure that any witnesses, whether I'm the expert witness, you're the expert witness, that we are familiar with procedures, that the attorney introduces the expert witness. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Kevin King, expert witness, has these certifications, etc. The opposing counsel may try to discredit the expert witness. Do you know that Kevin King only received his first certification back in 1996, and he's only received certifications as early as a month ago? Actually, never mind, because that's actually pretty good. So they may try to discredit the witness based on many different potential angles, and then the attorney will lead the expert witness through the evidence. So the attorney is standing in front while you're sitting in that seat that we always see on these shows, and the attorney will say, and then what did you discover? And then what was your next step? And then how did that work? And what came to your mind when you saw that? And in your expert opinion, you heard that over and over again. But later on, the attorney will say, that's all I have, Your Honor, and he'll sit down. And then the other attorney will get up and get you into cross-examination, where they will try to foul you up. And they'll say stuff like, what time did you say you collected the evidence? Yes, that was at 3 in the afternoon. And like, isn't 3 in the afternoon your nappy time? I'm making a joke out of it, but they're going to try to find things about you, your personality, the methods that you used, problems with the evidence. Now, that does not always happen. For instance, you might testify and the attorney will say that he's finished, and then the defense attorney or whatever on the other side will say that they don't have any questions either, and then just like, you think to yourself, whew, got off that one, and then you don't have to testify anymore, at least at that time. Let me tell you about how important an expert witness is. And go ahead and go open a browser tab, and in a browser tab, search for Connecticut versus Julie Amaro. Connecticut versus Julie Amaro. Julie Amaro was a substitute teacher that would periodically go to fill the minds of our children with great knowledge and acumen so they could pursue their lives into the rest of the world. But one day, she showed up as a substitute teacher, and one of the things she wanted to do was engage the children with something that was on the internet. Well, lo and behold, she went to a website and there were all these pop-ups, and they were pornographic pop-ups. And the minds of the little children observed all these pornographic pop-ups before Julie, who was freaking out at this time, finally got around to unplugging their computer. Well, obviously, if you expose children to pornographic images, you're going to be in trouble. And so she was processed as a criminal in the criminal justice system of Connecticut. While she was going through her trial and trying to explain what happened, nobody in that justice system understood how computers work. In fact, they hired expert witnesses to derail the case that the defense attorney was making for Julie Amero. They had computer expert witnesses that testified that there is no way that any of those images could have got on that computer system without Julie Amero doing it herself. Now, none of the expert witnesses, nor did the defense attorney ever ask questions like, was there antivirus software on that computer? Was there management of that computer with a firewall? Was that computer on Active Directory? They had no idea how PCs worked. You know why? The expert witnesses were experts at mainframes way back in the 80s. They had no idea what was going on with cybercrime, with hacking, with malware, with endpoint protection, with intrusion detection prevention systems, with firewalls. They had no idea how that worked. So they thought that it was only Julie Amero who was the one that made these images appear. So therefore, Julie Amero, there were many different crimes she was convicted of. The hammer went down and she was convicted after just visiting a web page. Well, a lot of people watching the case that were in the IT community and the cybersecurity community realized that it's an open and shut case. It was just a pop-up that went crazy on the system, and probably the actual real teacher who uses that computer had visited some bad sites before. Or it was just a cross-site script on a page, something like that. Also, people in the cybersecurity community and the IT community also knew that it was very likely that there was no endpoint protection on that system, which it turned out there wasn't. So there was no protection against her visiting that page. And everybody expected that Julie Amero would walk off scot-free, but instead she got convicted. And that is when the cybersecurity and IT community in Connecticut rose up and they said, excuse me, wait a minute, what are you doing here? And they helped with the investigation, and they got virtually all of Julie Amero's conviction vacated, except for she had to pay a fine and she had to forfeit her teaching license, which I think is also still a tragedy. So if expert witnesses are not actually experts in the field of the jurisprudence of the investigation, then things can go wrong. So that's why we need you to be a forensic investigator that knows what you are doing, and you can help out in the case as an expert witness. So that is an extremely important part of the forensic investigation process. So what we've seen in this module is we looked at the importance of forensic investigation and some of the activities from pre to investigation to post-investigation, finishing off with a regaled tale of what can happen if you're not a good expert witness. In the next module, we're going to look at hard drives and file systems. Join me there.